Finally, I think it's important to use human rights to change the perception on the Hill and throughout the U.S. that there is no constituency for human rights in the United States. We hear time and time again as human rights advocates domestically that people in the U.S. don't care about human rights, that they see it as foreign policy, when really it's the government that sees it as foreign policy. And the Opportunity Agenda and other organizations have done study after study, focus group after focus group, that show that the average American across demographics not only cares about human rights, but understands that they have inalienable inherent human rights and wants those human rights protected for everyone. So finally, how do we use human rights to advocate for sexual freedom? We do so in a variety of ways. We can do so through advocacy within the regional and global mechanisms that I talked about, the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights here in our backyard in DC, and the United Nations, both in New York and Geneva. This year, the United States is being reviewed by the United Nations for the first time in a new mechanism called the Universal Periodic Review. The Universal Periodic Review is where every 4 years, each country who is a part of the United Nations system is reviewed on its human rights record in totality. So not just the treaty bodies that monitor the race treaty, the gender treaty, what have you, but the United States, a spotlight is shown on the United States in terms of our human rights record across the board, and importantly, not only in the treaties that we've ratified, but our aspirational obligations under the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and other so-called non-binding human rights documents. And fortunately, the Obama administration is the first administration in US history to really choose to engage in this process. The UPR, in November, the US will go before the UN in Geneva for hearings, and activists have an opportunity to go there. And importantly, the US Human Rights Network, which the Woodhull Freedom Foundation is an active member of, brings grassroots activists from local communities throughout the US who otherwise would never be able to afford to go to Geneva to testify before the UN on a whole host of social justice issues impacting their lives. We also use special mechanisms, such as a special rapporteur, who are independent, non-governmental experts on issues such as housing, violence against women, internal displacement, who visit countries and tour supermax prisons, for example, and find out what are the actual conditions inside, and then report that within the UN system. We use petitions and hearings at the Inter-American Commission, and we need to use those more. Like I said before, I'm a part of the Bringing Human Rights Home Lawyers Network, and we meet with the Inter-American Commission every year here in DC. And for many, many years, US activists only used the commission for death penalty cases and criminal punishment-related cases. But after the Jessica Gonzalez case a couple years ago, which was a domestic violence case out of Colorado, the commission is very interested to hear from US advocates about gender and sexuality issues, and they often hear from Latin American and Caribbean activists about these issues, but have pretty much heard very little from those in the US. And when I'm talking about petitioning or doing a hearing at the Inter-American Commission, we're talking about focusing on domestic issues. So it's important to keep in mind we're not talking about comparative law or talking for people outside of the US. We're talking about domestic advocacy, bringing it to a new level of which the US needs to be held accountable. The second way that we do human rights advocacy around sexual freedom is at the federal level. Woodhull is part of the Human Rights at Home campaign, which is, again, a very diverse coalition based here in DC that's working to get the Obama administration to implement an interagency working group on human rights, which would put a point person on human rights in every federal agency so that it's no longer only reliant upon the State Department, which reinforces this idea that human rights are something foreign policy related and civil rights are something domestic policy related. It's also looking to create an independent body, which would be the U.S. Civil and Human Rights Commission, to transform the current U.S. Civil Rights Commission, which is pretty much ineffective to say the least and often regressive on many of our social justice issues. And finally, to make sure that treaty ratification happens for those treaties like the Children's Rights Convention, the Women's Rights Convention, and the People with Disabilities Convention that we've not yet ratified, and to ensure that there's effective implementation and enforcement at the federal, state, and local level. for the treaties we have ratified. And it's important to note that local and state governments have obligations whenever we ratify a treaty, the same as the federal government. But often local and state officials have no idea about treaty anything. So local implementation campaigns are happening around the country, not only in New York, but in many locales from Eugene, Oregon to Atlanta, Georgia, and elsewhere, where grassroots organizing and movement building is being used to bring in intersectional, diverse group of communities to advocate for implementation of human rights principles at the local level. We do human rights education and anti-oppression education, which in my mind go hand in hand. For many years, I was an anti-oppression educator and still do that work, but I think that it's important that people that do anti-oppression education have a firm understanding and working knowledge of human rights, and that human rights educators understand anti-oppression and what that means. So as I transition to our next couple of amazing speakers, I just want to reinforce before Kenyon and Amber come up, that human rights advocacy in the U.S., particularly around economic, social, cultural, and sexual rights, is about basic needs, everything from food, shelter, and decent employment, to having, a stable place to live in a safe environment. But it's also a very revolutionary act within the context of the U.S. that has tried for decades to keep us from having the economic, social, cultural, and sexual rights that are ours by virtue of our birth. Thank you.